Hi everyone, welcome to the release highlights of the second half of 2025 of SuccessFactors. Before we start, a small introduction of myself. My name is Erwan. I'm a SuccessFactors consultant at Flexso, with a main focus on compensation and employee central. The following modules will be covered today for the release highlights, so platform and reporting, onboarding and recruiting, employee central, goals and performance, and learning. So let's get started straight away with platform and reporting. The first highlight being the latest people profile and the enhancements made to the profile preview and the spotlight cards. The first enhancement is related to the organization information spotlight cards, where now the first 4 non-empty fields will be shown by default. The second highlight is the deactivation of the self-description, which allows employees to deactivate their own self-description. The third one being the view direct reports and team size, which allows to immediately navigate to the profile of the direct reports and the team of the employees. The fourth one being the uploading of the background images, which of course allows employees to upload their own background images to their own profiles. And the last one being the add fields to the profile header, which allows to add specific fields to the profile header for more direct information of the employee. The second highlight of today is the enhancements made to the Managed Languages tool. Of course, the Managed Languages tool is a tool to change the labels in specific languages used throughout the SuccessFactors suite. It is now possible to update translations directly in the UI, whereas previously it was only possible via an import and export. That option is of course still possible, but now you can also do it directly in SuccessFactors. An important tip when it comes to using this tool is if you do not know the label code, you can of course find out by using the debug language. The third highlight of today is the data export from the query designer in the story reports. It's now possible to export raw data directly from the query designer page using the export data button. Of course, the query designer page is the page where you configure your queries, which essentially feed the story reports with information. And with this feature, you can now export those specific queries directly to your own desktop. This of course provides more flexibility, efficiency in handling such large data sets, and grants easier access to raw report data for analysis and sharing with colleagues. Moving on to the next module, onboarding and recruiting, with the highlight being the automation of the onboarding initiation from recruiting. Of course, previously SAP made it possible to automate the process from onboarding to Employee Central, and now they've streamlined this possibility to automate the onboarding initiation directly from recruiting. It is now possible, as I said before, to automatically start this onboarding for all those candidates in recruiting which are marked as ready to hire. It supports both the automatic and the manual initiations through a specific business rule where you can define specific conditions. Very important note here is the offer approval must be completed first and the candidate is moved to the status ready to hire. Moving on to the next module, Employee Central. The first highlight being the mass data management. Of course, mass data management was a tool that was already introduced, which they have enhanced in this current release. It supports the mass data management of positions, job information, and job relationships as of this release. An example would be, for example, to update the HR manager for specific employees with the same department and location combination. Another enhancement that they made to this tool is that you can now edit the drafts directly before submitting the final mass change. And the final one is it is now possible to process up to 1,000 records, which essentially means if you're making one change, you can apply the same change up to 1,000 employees at the same time. Then the next highlight is the redesigned dependence editing UI and the history UI, which of course is part of a broader change, which is the new editing UI and history UI applied for the new full profile. As you can see on the screen, the dependence editing UI and history UI has been changed, where now on the left-hand side you have the dependents listed one below the other, and by clicking one of the dependents on the right-hand side you will see the details, from which you can also access the editing UI and the historical records directly. Moving on to the next module, which is the goals and performance module, with the first highlight being the replacement of the legacy performance form experience. Of course, this is something that was already introduced announced by SAP previously, but has now been enforced in this current release, which means that the legacy experience of the performance management forms will now be completely replaced by the latest experience. This deletion will take place in the second half of the upcoming year, and the end of development already in this current release. Then the next highlight is the transfer of individual talent data from inactive to active employments. Of course, this is something that was asked very often in cases where an employee was rehired into a new job in the same company, where certain talent data would be useful to have directly in that new active profile. And with this new feature, that is made possible. So you can transfer all the person's talent data from one inactive to active employment in one single step. However, important to mention that only full transfers are allowed and partial transfers are therefore disallowed. And then the last highlight for goals and performance is the enhancements to the business rules, scenarios, context, and functions, which specifically covers two new rule scenarios. The first one being the changing of the field visibility, editability, and the required status on forms, which essentially means you can change those three attributes with business rules. An example of that would be if a rating of 1 is submitted, an additional mandatory comment field would pop up for those specific forms. Similarly, the other business rule, add review steps upon form routing, can also add as an additional form route step to the approval flow. For example, if a rating of 1 is applied, an additional approval step would have to be followed in the approval flow. And moving on to the last module of the current release highlights is learning. The first highlight here is the universal rollout of the new learning homepage. Of course, a feature that was announced previously as well, and has now been enforced in its current release, meaning that the new learning homepage is now universally enabled and it is not possible to revert back anymore. Customers still using the legacy experience are therefore automatically upgraded, and both the switches for the new learning experience and the normal switch and the new learning experience switch default setting option are therefore also removed. And the last highlight for today, also for learning, is the bulk deleting of unused iContent files from LMS. This is something that was not previously not possible and has now been introduced as this release, and which allows to identify and bulk delete unused or irrelevant content stored in the iContent servers. This is done directly from the iContent management page, where you can view overall iContent usage, access affiliated courses, and schedule deletion of unused files. Thank you for joining us today, and hope to see you next time.